Holy heck, I am so glad that this is like the fourth time I've had to do this, because every time I've went to sit down, I just keep forgetting one thing, and it's like, gosh darn it. Anyway, my name is Tanner, you're watching Shlama Show, and we're continuing our CIA deep dive. We're getting right back into it, and we're going to be talking about a lot of fun stuff today. If you haven't noticed last time, we talked about Alan Dulles and the Bay of Pigs, so we're going to carry on that discussion with some interesting discourse on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But before we get into that, thanks for watching. I really, really, really appreciate it. We got a bunch of CIA videos coming out in the future. We got a bunch of stuff coming with our boy Eli in the future. Our newest podcast is out. You can check that out on his channel. Link in the description. But before we really start talking about that, could you consider liking and subscribing this? Not only does liking this video share it to other people, but it also gives me 50 health points. You know, I need those health points, guys. I really, 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 really need those health points. Been playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons lately, a lot of video games on my Twitch channel. Twitch.tv games are. And I need those health points, man. I really, really need those health points. So liking this video gives me 50 of them. Thanks for watching. I'm just pulling your leg. Mostly just trying to push past the 2-minute mark so I can say the fun words, okay? Okay, so let's get into that. Today we're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of our sources are gathered from not only the free encyclopedia known as Wikipedia, but also just various other bits of information that people have told me along the way. How much of it is real? Well, that's up for you to decide. I am simply a student here to educate you. So let's get into it. The Cuban Missile Crisis, also known as the October Crisis, or in Spanish, the Crisis de Octubre, or the Caribbean Crisis, was a 13-day confrontation between the governments of the United States and the Soviet Union, when American deployments of nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey were matched by Soviet deployments of nuclear missiles in Cuba. The crisis lasted from the 16th to the 28th of October, 1962, and the confrontation is widely to be considered the closest now we ever came to a full-scale nuclear war. The closest, you say? But I've heard a story about this Stanislav Petrov guy before, and that was the closest. Well, that was the closest we really got. Make sure I said his name right. Stanislav Petrov was the closest we actually got. God rest his soul, the nuclear Armageddon. But that was unofficial business, right? That was unofficial business, that whole Stanislav Petrov ordeal. This is official. About as official as it gets. And I know you're probably hearing my nose sniffle a lot, and that's pollen, so fuck you. We aren't no junka here. Why do you think I'm up recording this at such a late hour? Because I tried to sleep and I fucking couldn't. Anyway, let's get into it. You know, you audio perverts. Let's get into it. It's the closest we came to a full-scale nuclear war. I'm gonna download these. Boop. Just so you could see them. Boop. That's a nice missile. The result of the conflict was a publicized removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba and a non-publicized removal of American missiles from Turkey and Italy. And an agreement with the Soviet Union that the United States would never invade Cuba without a direct provocation. Also, a creation of a nuclear hotline. Man, that sounds awesome. A nuclear hotline between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The parties involved were the Soviets in Cuba, the United States, Italy, Turkey, and for some fucking reason, Venezuela. The strength... No. The only casualties were a U-2 spy aircraft with the pilot inside of it. Hey, remember that U-2 aircraft that I talked about in the last video? Hey! It's almost like it's connected. In 1961, the U.S. government put Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey. It had trained a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles, which led the CIA an attempt to invade Cuba and overthrow its government. I fotched that sentence, I'm so sorry. Starting in November of that year, the U.S. government engaged in a violent campaign of terrorism and sabotage in Cuba, referred to as the Cuban Project, which continued throughout the first half of the 1960s. The Soviet administration was concerned about a Cuban drift towards China, with the Soviets had increasingly fractious relationship. In which the Soviets had an increasingly fractious relationship. In response to these factors, the Soviet and Cuban governments agreed at a meeting between leaders Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro in July 1962 to place nuclear missiles on Cuba to deter a future invasion. Construction of several launch facilities, started shortly after. A U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence of medium and long-range launch facilities in October of that year. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, Mr. JFK, convened a meeting of the National Security Council with key other advisors, forming the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or XCOM. Kennedy was advised to carry out an airstrike on Cuban soil in order to compromise Soviet missile supplies, followed by an invasion of the Cuban mainland. He chose a less aggressive course in order to avoid a declaration of war. On the 22nd of October, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to prevent further missiles from reaching Cuba. He referred to the blockade as a quarantine, not a blockade, so the U.S. could avoid the formal implications of starting a war. Yeah. Sounds like the worst thing that would have happened had he... Man, as agreements eventually reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev, publicly the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba, subject to the United Nations verification in exchange for a U.S. public declaration and an agreement not to invade Cuba again. Secretly, the U.S. agreed to dismantle all of the offensive weapons it deployed to Turkey. There has been debate on whether Italy was also included in the agreement. Some say yes, others not so much. While the Soviets dismantled their missiles, some Soviet bombers remained in Cuba, and the United States kept the naval quarantine in place until the 20th of November, 1962. The blockade was formally ended on the 20th of November after all offensive missiles and bombers had been withdrawn from Cuba. The evident necessity of a quick and direct communication line between the two powers resulted in the Moscow-Washington hotline. What is that? Let's read. But it was a series of agreements. A series of agreements later reduced the tensions for several years. Let's read more about the Moscow-Soviet hotline. The Moscow-Soviet hotline is a system that allows direct communication between the leaders of the U.S. and the Russian Federation. The hotline was established in 1963 and links the Pentagon with the Kremlin. Although in popular culture it's known as the red telephone, the hotline was never a telephone line. No red phones were used. The first implementation used teletype equipment and was shifted to fax machines. Since 2008, the hotline has been secure through email. Now you know, and knowing is half the battle. The compromise embarrassed Khrushchev and the Soviet Union because of the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Italy and Turkey was a secret deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the Soviets were seen as retreating from a situation they had started. Khrushchev's fall from power 2 years later was in part because of the Soviet Politburo's embarrassment at both Khrushchev's eventual concessions and his ineptitude in precipitating the crisis. According to Dobrynin, the top Soviet leadership took the Cuban outcome as, quote, a blow to its prestige bordering on humiliation. Now, that sounds like a lot. That sounds like a lot. I mean, that's a nice synopsis. But how really humiliating was this? In late 1961, Fidel Castro asked for more SA anti-aircraft missiles from the Soviet Union. The request was not acted upon by the Soviet leadership. In the interval, Castro began criticizing the Soviets for a lack of revolutionary boldness and began talking to China about agreements for economic assistance. In March of 1962, Castro ordered the ousting of Anibal Escalante and his pro-Moscow comrades from Cuba's integrated revolutionary organizations. The affair alarmed the Soviet leadership as well as raised fears of a possible U.S. invasion. As a result, the Soviet Union sent more missiles in April, as well as a regiment of regular Soviet Union troops, to make sure things are Gucci between the two countries. Historian Timothy Naftali has contended that Escalante's dismissal was a motivating factor behind the Soviet Union's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. I mean, that makes sense. Hear me out. If I were a leader of a country, and all of a sudden I just got rid of all of my my representatives who were envoys to another country, that'd be pretty fucking alarming, for sure. That'd be pretty alarming. So, not really. At least if you were in the game of empire, right? Whew. Nice. The Cuban government regarded U.S. imperialism as the primary explanation for the island's structural weaknesses. You're not wrong. The U.S. government provided arms, money, and authority to the military dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista that ruled Cuba until Castro took over. Majority of the Cuban population had tired of the severe socioeconomic problems associated with the U.S. dominating the country. Not much has changed. The Cuban government was thus aware of the necessity of ending the turmoil and its incongruities of U.S.-dominated pre-revolution Cuban society. It determined that the U.S. government's demands, made as part of a hostile U.S. reaction to the Cubans' government policy, it was determined that the U.S.'s government demands, made as part of a hostile U.S. reaction to Cuban policy, were unacceptable. There we are. With the end of the Cold War and the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War, the U.S. government sought to promote private enterprise as an instrument of advancing U.S. strategic interests in the developing world. It also had grown concerned about the expansion of communism, and really the only reason they were doing this is so they could stop communism, but I'm not gonna really go into that. Oh, I'm just kidding, I'm gonna go into that. In December of 1959, under the Eisenhower administration, and less than 12 months after the Cuban Revolution, the CIA developed a plan for paramilitary action against Cuba. The CIA recruited operatives on the island to carry out terrorism and sabotage, kill civilians, and cause economic change. At the initiative of CIA Deputy Director for Plans Richard Bizzle and approved by the new president, Mr. Kennedy, the U.S. launched the Bay of Pigs. And you can watch the other video for that. Afterwards, though, the former President Eisenhower told Kennedy that the failure of the Bay of Pigs will embolden the Soviets to do something that they would otherwise not do. And you know what? When you gotta give it to them when you gotta give it to them. It's not necessarily, and they didn't, but you could understand why he would think that. Following the failed invasion, the U.S. massively escalated its sponsorship of terrorism against Cuba, starting in late 1961 using the military and the CIA. The U.S. government engaged in an extensive campaign of state-sponsored terrorism against civilian and military targets of the island. The terrorist attacks killed significant numbers of civilians. The U.S. armed, trained, funded, and directed the terrorists, most of whom were Cuban expatriates. Terrorist attacks were planned at the direction and with the participation of U.S. government employees and launched from U.S. territory. In January of 1962, the U.S. Air Force General Edward Lansdale described the plans to overthrow the Cuban government in a top-secret report addressed to Kennedy and the officials involved with Operation Mongoose. CIA agents, or pathfinders, from the Special Activities Division were to be infiltrated into Cuba to carry out sabotage and organization, including radio broadcasts. In February 1962, the U.S. launched an embargo against Cuba, and Lansdale presented a 26-page top-secret timetable for implementation of the overthrow of the Cuban government, mandating guerrilla operations to begin in August and September. Quote, open revolt and overthrow of the communist regime was hoped by the planners to occur in the first 2 weeks of October. Didn't sound like that happened. Terrorism campaign and the threat of invasion were crucial factors in the Soviet decision to position the missiles on Cuba and in the Cuban government's decision to accept. The U.S. government was aware at the time, as reported to the President in an National Intelligence Estimate, that the invasion threat was a key reason for Cuban acceptance of the missiles. Damn. The more you know. While Kennedy ran for president in 1960, one of his key election issues was an alleged missile gap with the Soviets. In fact, the U.S. at the time led the Soviets by a wide margin, which would only increase over time. In 1961, the Soviets had only 4 intercontinental ballistic missiles. In October, they argued they had 75. The U.S., on the other hand, had 170 at the time and was quickly building more. It also had 8 George Washington and Ethan Allen-class ballistic missile submarines with the capability to launch 16 Polaris missiles, each with a range of 2,500 nautical miles. The Soviet First Secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, increased the perception of a missile gap when he loudly boasted to the world that the Soviets were building missiles like sausages. But Soviet missile numbers and capabilities were nowhere close to his assertions. Nowhere close. The Soviet Union had medium-range ballistic missiles in quantity, about 700 of them, but they were unreliable and inaccurate. The U.S. had a considerable advantage in its total number of nuclear warheads, 27,000 against 3,600, and the technology required for their accurate delivery. The U.S. also led in missile defensive capabilities, naval and air power. However, the Soviet held a 2-to-1 advantage in conventional ground forces, more pronounced in field guns and tanks, particularly in the European theater. Khrushchev also had an impression of Kennedy as weak, which to him was confirmed by the president's response during the Berlin crisis of 1961, particularly to the building of the Berlin Wall by East Germany to prevent its citizens from immigrating to the West. I mean, Kennedy was, weak as hell. Kennedy was probably, besides, I don't know, maybe Joe Biden, Kennedy's probably was the most drug-addled president. I'm not even kidding. And it's not necessarily his fault. My guy's body was killing him by the time he was president. JFK's body was just collapsing. He had spine issues. There's a reason he was on all the drugs that he was on. 1,000,000%. I mean, he was weak. He was a weak boy. He was the weakest of the Kennedys. I would. No, I'm kidding. The half-hearted nature of the Bay and Pigs invasion reinforced Khrushchev and his advisors' impression that Kennedy was indecisive and, as one Soviet aide wrote, too young, intellectual, not prepared well for decision-making in crisis situations, too intelligent, and too weak. That sounds about right. Speaking to Soviet officials in the aftermath of the crisis, Khrushchev asserted, "I know for certain that Kennedy doesn't have a strong background, nor, generally speaking, does he have the courage to stand up to a more serious challenge." He also told his son Sergei that on Cuba, Kennedy would, quote, make more of a fuss, and then agree. That sounds about right. That sounds about right. Nothing bad ever happened to the Kennedys. In May 1962, Khrushchev was persuaded by the idea of countering the U.S.'s growing lead in development and deploying strategic missiles by placing Soviet immediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, despite the misgivings of the Soviet ambassador in Havana, who argued that Castro would not accept the deployment of the missiles. Khrushchev faced a strategic situation which the U.S. was perceived to have a splendid first-take capability that put the Soviet Union at a huge disadvantage. In 1962, the Soviet had only 20 ICBMs capable of delivering nuclear warheads to the U.S. from inside the Soviet Union. The poor accuracy and reliability of the missiles raised serious doubts about their effectiveness. A newer, more reliable generation of ICBMs would become operational only after 1965. Damn, that's impressive, honestly. Damn. Therefore, Soviet nuclear capability in 1962 placed less emphasis on ICBMs than on medium-ranged missiles, MRBMs and IRBMs. The missiles could hit American allies and most of Alaska, but not the continental U.S. Ow, my nose. Sorry. Graham Allison, the director of Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, points out, quote, "The Soviet Union could not right the nuclear imbalance by deploying new ICBMs on its own soil in order to meet the threat that it faced. In 1962, 63, and 64, it had very few options. Moving existing nuclear weapons to locations from which they could reach America targets was one. We had very few options. The second reason that the Soviet deployed missiles to Cuba was that Khrushchev wanted to bring West Berlin, wanted to bring West Berlin, controlled by the Americans, within East Germany, into the Soviet orbit. The East Germans and the Soviets considered Western control over a portion of Berlin a grave threat to East Germany. For some reason, Khrushchev made West Berlin the central battlefield of the Cold War. Khrushchev believed that if the U.S. did nothing over the missile deployments in Cuba, he could muscle the West out of Berlin using said missiles. If the U.S. tried the bargain, it became aware that the missiles Khrushchev could demand if the U.S. tried the bargain with the Soviets after it became aware of the missiles, Khrushchev could demand trading the missiles for West Berlin. Since Berlin was strategically more important than Cuba, the trade would be a win for Khrushchev. As Kennedy recognized, quote, "The advantage is, from Khrushchev's point of view, he takes a great chance, but there are quite some rewards to it. Nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys." Thirdly, from the perspective of the Soviet Union and Cuba, it seemed that the U.S. wanted to invade or increase its presence in Cuba. In view of actions, including the attempt to expel Cuba from the Organization of American States, the ongoing campaign of violent terrorist attacks on civilians the U.S. was carrying out against the island, economic sanctions against the country, and the earlier attempt to invade it, Cuban officials understood that America was trying to overrun the country. As a result, to try and prevent this, the USSR would place missiles in Cuba and neutralize the threat. This would ultimately serve to secure Cuba against attack and keep the country in the socialist bloc. Would it work? Who knows? Another major reason why Khrushchev planned to place missiles on Cuba undetected was to level the playing field. With the evident American nuclear threat, America had the upper hand as they could launch from Turkey and destroy the USSR before they would even have a chance to react. After the emplacement of nuclear missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev had finally established mutually assured destruction. Meaning that if the United States decided to launch a nuclear strike, the latter would react by launching a retaliatory strike against the U.S. Mutually assured destruction. It's a hell of a concept. Finally, placing the nuclear missiles on Cuba was a way for the U.S. to show their support for Cuba and support the Cuban people who viewed the United States as a threatening force, as the latter had become their ally after the Cuban Revolution of 1959. According to Khrushchev, the Soviet Union's motives were aimed at following Cuba to live peacefully and develop as its people desire. That sounds about right. Sorry, I'm just making sure that, the rest of the information is viable. In early 1962, a group of Soviet military and missile construction specialists accompanied an agricultural delegation to Havana. They attained a meeting with Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro. The Cuban leadership had a strong expectation that the U.S. would invade Cuba again and enthusiastically approved the idea of installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. Enthusiastically approved the idea. According to another source, Castro objected to the missile's deployment as making him look like a Soviet puppet. Either way, the deployment would include short-range tactical weapons that would provide a nuclear umbrella for attacks upon the island. I really like that term, nuclear umbrella. Damn. By May, Khrushchev and Castro agreed to place strategic nuclear missiles secretly to Cuba. Like Castro, Khrushchev felt it was important, and to lose Cuba would do a great harm, especially in Latin America. And he said he wanted to confront the Americans with, quote, more than words. The logical answer was missiles. From the very beginning, the Soviet operation entailed elaborate denial and deception. All the planning and preparation for transporting was carried out with the utmost secrecy, and only a few told of the exact nature. Even the troops were given misdirection by being told that they were heading for a cold region and being outfitted with ski boots, fleece-lined parkas, and other winter equipment. The Soviet code name was Operation Anadyr. The Anadyr River flows into the Bering Sea, and Anadyr is also the capital of the Chukotsky district and a bomber base in the far eastern region. All the measures were meant to conceal the program, both internally and externally. No one was to know about this. Specialists under the guise of machine operators arrived in July. A total of 43,000 troops would be brought in. In the first few days of setting up the missiles, troops complained of fuse failures, excessive corrosion, overconsumption of oil, and generator blackouts. That sounds about right. So what happens next? Well, what happens next is people start getting suspicious. CIA John McCone was suspicious, so fast as sending anti-aircraft missiles into Cuba. He reasoned made only sense if Moscow intended to use them as a shield, a base for ballistic missiles aimed at the U.S. On the 10th of August, he wrote a memo to Kennedy, which he guessed that the Soviets were preparing to introduce ballistic missiles. Che Guevara himself traveled to the Soviet Union to sign off on a final agreement regarding the deployment of the missiles. The visit was heavily monitored by the CIA, as Guevara had gained a lot more scrutiny by the U.S. intelligence. While the Soviet Union and Guevara agreed that Khrushchev that the missile deal should be made public, but Khrushchev insisted on total secrecy and swore the Soviet Union's support if the Americans discovered the missiles. By the time Guevara arrived in Cuba, the United States had already discovered the troops in Cuba via U-2 spy planes. Wah wah. It escalates further, because as you would expect, Air Force General Curtis LeMay presented a pre-invasion bombing plan to Kennedy in September, and spy flights and minor military harassment from U.S. forces at Guantanamo Bay Naval Force were subject to continual Cuban diplomatic complaints to the U.S. government. The first consignment of Soviet R-12 missiles arrived on the night of 8th of September, followed by a second on the 16th of September. The R-12 was a medium-range ballistic missile capable of carrying a thermonuclear warhead, and it was a single-stage, road-transportable, surface-launched, storable liquid propellant-fueled missile that could deliver a megaton-class nuclear weapon. Citation needed. The Soviets were building 9 sites. 6 for R-12 medium-range missiles, NATO designation SS-4 Sandal, with an effective range of about 1,200 miles, and 3 for R-14 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, with a maximum range of about 2,800 miles. Citation needed. On the 7th of October, Cuban President Osvaldo Tirado spoke at the UN General Assembly, quote, "If we are attacked, we will defend ourselves." I repeat, we have sufficient means which to defend ourselves. We have indeed our inevitable weapons, the weapons which we would have preferred not to acquire and which we wish to not employ. On the 11th of October, in another Senate speech, Senator Keating reaffirmed his earlier warning by saying, quote, construction has begun on at least half a dozen missiles launching for intermediate, blah, 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 just warmongering, not really. Construction is, blah, 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 blah. The Cuban leadership was further upset when on the 20th of September, the U.S. Senate approved the Joint Resolution 230, which expressed the U.S. was determined to prevent in Cuba the creation or use of an externally supported military capability endangering the security of the United States. On the same day, the U.S. announced a major military exercise in the Caribbean, which Cuba denounced as deliberate provocation and proved the U.S. planned to invade Cuba. Unreliable source? Question mark? Who knows? The Soviet Union believed, based on the perception of Kennedy's lack of confidence during the Bay of Pigs, that he would avoid a confrontation, and accept the missiles as a fait accompli. I'm botching that word. On 9/11, the Soviet Union publicly warned a U.S. attack on Cuba or on Soviet ships that were carrying supplies to the island would mean war. The Soviets continued the Maskarkova program to conceal their actions in Cuba. They repeatedly denied that the weapons being brought into Cuba were offensive in nature. Back on 9/11, the telegraph agency of the Soviet Union, TASS, announced that the Soviet Union had no need or intention to introduce offensive nuclear missiles into Cuba. On the 13th of October, Dobrynin was questioned by Chester Bowles about whether the Soviets planned to put offensive weapons in Cuba. He denied any such claims. Missiles! The missiles in Cuba allowed the Soviets to effectively target control of the continental U.S. To effectively target most of the U.S. The planned arsenal was 40 launchers. Only 5 reports bothered the analysts. They described large trucks passing through towns at night that were carrying very long canvas-covered cylindrical objects. Surely not missiles. Surely not missiles. I don't know. You take a look at this picture. I don't know. Those are missiles, guys. I don't know, man. And then they had aerial confirmation, blah blah blah, blah 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 blah. Following the loss of a CIA U-2 over the Soviet Union in May 1960, it was thought that if another U-2 were shot down, an Air Force aircraft arguably being used for a legitimate military purpose would be easier to explain than a CIA flight. Yeah, no, basically, if you don't know, fuck, I completely missed this. We're on a CIA deep dive. I should have talked about this. They were doing spy planes around. The only reason we know about these pictures is because they were sending U-2 spy planes to, fly around Cuba, taking pictures. And one got shot down. One got shot down. So it's not actually, this entire thing is sparked by that single plane being shot down. Kind of a huge jump to not really think about, but it turns out, when another country's spying on another country, when the reconnaissance missions were reauthorized, the weather kept the planes from flying. The U.S. first obtained 2 photographs piloted when a U-2 fighter pilot piloted by Richard Heiser took 928 pictures. We don't have time to show you all of those. Of course, the president was eventually notified. The CIA notified the Department of State at approximately 8:30 p.m. Bundy chose to wait until the next morning. Meanwhile, fucking McNamara was briefed at midnight. Bundy met with Kennedy the next morning and showed him. Kennedy convened with a meeting at 6:30 p.m. and a group of formerly named XCOM after the fact on the 20s. And without informing the members of XCOM, President Kennedy tape recorded all of their proceedings. And Sheldon M. Stern, head of the Kennedy Library, transcribed some of them. In the 16th of October, Kennedy informed his brother that he was convinced that the Soviets were placing missiles and it was a legitimate threat. Robert Kennedy expressed his concern about what was happening, and Doberan was instructed by the chairman Khrushchev to assure Kennedy that there would be no ground-to-ground missiles. Here were some of the responses that they considered. A. Do nothing. American vulnerability to Soviet missiles was not new. 2. Diplomacy. Use diplomatic pressures. This is what they did. Secret approach. Offer Castro the choice of splitting with the Soviets or being invaded. Full-blown invasion, airstrike, or blockade. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously agreed that a full-scale attack and the invasion were the only solution. Kennedy was skeptical, saying, "They, no more than we, can let these things go by without doing something. They can't, after all their statements, permit us to take out their missiles, kill a lot of Russians, and then do nothing. If they don't take action in Cuba, they certainly will in Berlin. And ich eine Berliner." Kennedy concluded that attacking Cuba by air would signal the Soviets to presume a clear line to conquer Berlin. Kennedy also believed that the U.S. allies would think of the country as trigger-happy cowboys who lost Berlin because they could not peacefully resolve the Cuban situation. He's not wrong. The ex-com then discussed the effect on the strategic balance of power, both politically and militarily. The Joint Chiefs of Staff believed that the missiles would seriously alter the military balance, but McNamara disagreed. At an extra 40, he reasoned, would make little difference to the overall strategic balance. The U.S. already had approximately 5,000 missiles, but the Soviet Union had only 300. McNamara concluded that the Soviets having 340 would not substantially alter the strategic balance. In 1990, he reiterated that it made no difference. The military balance wasn't changed. I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now. He's not wrong. He's not wrong, and it's like evil State Department, like, I want to be evil kind of, he's not wrong. I mean, technically, if you have more nukes than the blah, blah, blah. The ex-com agreed that the missiles would affect the political balance. Kennedy had explicitly promised the American people less than a month before the crisis that, quote, "if Cuba shall possess a capacity to carry out offensive actions against the United States would act." Further, U.S. credibility among its allies and people would be damaged if the Soviet Union appeared to redress the strategic imbalance by placing missiles in Cuba. Kennedy explained after the crisis, quote, that it would have politically changed the balance of power. It would have appeared to, in appearances, contribute to reality. On the 18th of October, Kennedy met with Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Andrei Gromyko, who claimed the weapons were for defensive purposes only, not wanting to expose what he already knew. Kennedy did not reveal that he was already aware of the missile buildup. Well, let's talk about the resolution. We've been on this for long enough. Let's talk about the resolution. On Saturday, the 27th of October, after much deliberation between the Soviet Union and Kennedy's cabinet, Kennedy secretly agreed to remove all missiles in Turkey and possibly southern Italy, the former on the border of the Soviet Union, in exchange for Khrushchev putting all missiles out of Cuba. There is some dispute as to whether removing missiles from Italy was part of the secret agreement, but needless to say, Khrushchev knew that he was losing control. President Kennedy had been told in early 1961 that a nuclear war would likely kill a third of all humanity, with most or all of those deaths concentrated in the USA, the USSR, Europe, and China. Khrushchev may have received similar reports at the time. With this background, when Khrushchev heard Kennedy's threats relayed by Robert Kennedy, he immediately drafted his acceptance of Kennedy's terms from his DACA without involving the Politburo, as he had previously done, and then immediately broadcast them over to Radio Moscow, which he believed the U.S. would hear. In that broadcast, on the 28th of October, Khrushchev stated, "The Soviet Union, in addition to previously issued instructions on the cessation of further work at the building sites for the weapons, has issued a new order on the dismantling of the weapons which you describe as, quote, offensive, and their crating in return to the Soviet Union." At 10 a.m. on the 28th of October, Kennedy learned of Khrushchev's solution and said, "This is a pretty good play of his. He embraced the offer," Kennedy said, according to a tape recording he made of the cabinet secretly. Kennedy had deployed the Jupiters in 1962, causing a stream of angry outbursts. "Most people will think that this is a rather even trade, and we ought to take advantage of it," Kennedy said. Lyndon Johnson was the first to endorse the missile swap, but others continued to impose. Finally, Kennedy ended the debate, saying, "We can't very well invade Cuba with all its toil and blood. We could have gotten them out by making a deal on the same missiles in Turkey. If that's a part of the record, then you don't have a very good war." Kennedy immediately responded to Khrushchev's letter, issuing a statement calling it, quote, "an important and constructive contribution to peace." He continued with a formal letter. "I consider my letter to you of October 27th in your reply to today a firm undertakings on the part of both of our governments, which should be promptly carried out. The U.S. will make a statement in the framework of the Security Council in reference to Cuba as it follows. It will declare that the United States of America will respect the inviolability of the Cuban borders, its sovereignty, and that it will take the pledge to not interfere in internal affairs, not to intrude themselves, and not to permit our territory to be used as a bridgehead for the invasion of Cuba, and will restrain those who plan to carry an aggression against Cuba, either from U.S. territory or from the territory of other countries neighboring to Cuba." And this pretty much ends it. I mean, we got a little bit here, but you know, by 1963, I mean, geez, there's a lot more. There's a lot more. I'm just kidding, there's not. Cuba perceived the outcome as a betrayal by the Soviets, as decisions on how to resolve the crisis had been made exclusively by Kennedy and Khrushchev. Castro was especially upset at the certain issues of interest to Cuba, such as the status of a base in Guantanamo, were not addressed. This caused Cuban relations to deteriorate with both the Soviets and the U.S. for quite some time. Yeah, the thing that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis was the base in Guantanamo. No, such as they weren't addressed. Like the whole point was that they didn't want a fucking naval base in Guantanamo Bay, and there's still a naval base in Guantanamo Bay. My name's John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Thank you for watching.